Every family history is a story of movement, perseverance, opportunity, and identity. And the Hedrich family tree is no exception. Spanning centuries and continents, it traces ancestors who lived vastly different lives, yet ultimately shaped the family we know today. From European villages and royal courts to American farms, factories, and neighborhoods, these generations form a rich tapestry that reflects both the immigrant experience and the broader history of America. The story begins long before the family's arrival in Illinois. Its roots extend across Germany, Sweden, Bohemia, Ireland, Scotland, and England, as well as into colonial America. Some ancestors came from small farming communities, while others were craftsmen, merchants, civic leaders, or notable historical figures. Over time, these diverse branches, each with its own culture, language, and traditions, converged in the American Midwest. German heritage stands out as a central theme, with ancestors from regions like Saxony and Prussia immigrating during periods of change and opportunity. Swedish and Central European branches similarly reflect the courage of those who left familiar homes to build new lives in America. English, Irish, and Scottish lines connect the family to early colonial settlers, linking modern descendants to the nation's earliest history. What makes this family history especially compelling is its range of experiences. Ancestors were farmers, laborers, craftsmen, soldiers, and community leaders, alongside connections to notable figures such as Sir Thomas More. By the 19th and 20th centuries, many of these lines converged in Chicago and Illinois, where immigrant communities helped shape the region's growth. Together, their stories form a powerful reflection of the American journey, one of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring legacy of generations past. Among the major branches of the family tree, the Hedrich line offers a clear example of the immigrant experience that helped shape modern Chicago. Beginning with Robert E. Hedrich and tracing back through Arthur Edward Hedrich and Edward Frederick Hedrich, this branch follows a journey from Saxony, Germany to Chicago in the 19th century. Along the way, it connects with the Simmons family, whose roots reach deep into colonial New England. The Hedrich line originates in Saxony, where Edward Frederick Hedrich was born on July 8, 1841. Like many Germans of his time, he lived through political and economic change before immigrating to the United States. By the 1870s, he had settled in Chicago, where his son Arthur Edward Hedrich was born in 1875. This places the family among the wave of German immigrants who helped transform Chicago into a rapidly growing city. Arthur Edward Hedrich represented the first American-born generation. Growing up in post-Great Fire Chicago, he witnessed the city's rise as a center of industry and commerce. Through Arthur and his son Robert Edward Hedrich, born in Milwaukee in 1912, the family became firmly rooted in the Chicago area. What began as a journey from Saxony evolved into a multi-generational Midwestern story. The marriage of Arthur Edward Hedrich to Florence May Simmons connected the family to a much older American lineage. The Simmons family traced its roots through New York and New England, with Florence's father, Albert T. Simmons, born in New York in 1834. Their westward movement into the Midwest reflects a common American pattern of migration in search of opportunity. The Simmons line reaches back even further through the Simmons family of colonial Massachusetts. Ancestors such as Robert Simmons, Jr. lived during the early years of New England's settlement, long before the American Revolution. Their descendants gradually moved from Massachusetts to New Hampshire, then to New York, and eventually to the Midwest. Together, the Hedrich and Simmons branches tell a unified American story. One begins with 19th-century German immigration. The other stretches back to the earliest colonial settlers. Their convergence in Chicago reflects the blending of new and old American histories, illustrating how different paths across centuries came together to form the Hedrich family of today. Edward Frederick Hedrich and the Sultana disaster. One of the most dramatic stories in the Hedrich family line centers on Edward Frederick Hedrich. Born in Saxony, Germany, in 1841, he immigrated to America and came of age as the Civil War began. Records suggest a complex military history, including early enlistment, a possible desertion, and later service under the name George Wilson. That alias may connect him to a remarkable chapter of the war. A George P. Wilson of the 9th Indiana Cavalry appears in records tied to the capture of Union troops at Sulphur Branch Trestle in northern Alabama in September 1864. When Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest attacked, the Union garrison was overwhelmed and forced to surrender. If Edward and Wilson were the same man, he then endured imprisonment at Cahaba Prison, where Union soldiers faced overcrowding, disease, hunger, and flooding. Many survived only to face another tragedy. In April 1865, recently released prisoners boarded the steamboat Sultana at Vicksburg, dangerously overcrowded and poorly repaired. On April 27, 1865, the Sultana exploded north of Memphis, killing more than 1,000 people in the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. Survivors were thrown into the river, burned, or drowned. Edward's obituary reportedly identified him as a survivor of the disaster. If accurate, his life story is extraordinary. Immigrant, soldier, prisoner, and survivor of both Cahaba and the Sultana. After the war, Edward settled in Chicago, married, raised a family, and served as a police officer. His life reflects both the hardship of war and the resilience to rebuild. His story connects the Hedrich family not only to the Civil War, but to one of its most tragic and often overlooked events. The Simons line, from Tudor England to colonial New England and the American Midwest. Among the branches connected to the Hedrich family, the Simons and Simons line offers one of the longest and most distinctly American journeys. Through Florence May Simons, wife of Arthur Edward Hedrich, this lineage reaches back beyond 19th century immigration to the earliest English settlers in North America. It begins in Tudor England, crosses the Atlantic during colonial expansion, and follows the westward growth of the United States into New England, New York, and the Midwest. This line reflects key stages of early American history. It includes English villagers under the Tudors and Stuarts, settlers in colonial Massachusetts, families moving into Connecticut and New Hampshire, pioneers in post-revolutionary New York, and later generations in Chicago and northern Illinois. Few branches illustrate the development of America as clearly. Early origins in England. The family's earliest known ancestors lived in rural England during the 16th century. Figures such as Thomas Simons Simmons, born around 1505, lived through the English Reformation and the rise of Tudor power. Though records are limited, they show a family rooted in agricultural life during a time of major national change. John Benbow Simons, born in Suffolk in the early 17th century, represents a key link to migration. Suffolk was a major source of settlers to New England, placing the family within the networks that led to colonial America. The journey to New England. By the mid-17th century, the family had settled in Essex County, Massachusetts. John Symonds, born in Bradford in 1594, lived in a frontier community where survival depended on cooperation and hard work. These early generations helped establish the foundations of colonial society. The Symonds family in New England. Francis Symonds of Danvers, Massachusetts, was the owner of Bell Tavern, which was, by all accounts, the center of life and politics in that town. In 1770, the Sons of Liberty brought an accused seller of boycotted tea to the tavern and made him sign a confession and apology. The morning of April 19, 1775, local militia companies gathered at the Bell Tavern before marching to Monotamy, Arlington, Massachusetts, to intercept British regulars returning to Boston from their expedition to Concord. Symonds himself took part in the Battle of Monotamy, the bloodiest engagement of the day. After the war's close, the citizens of Danvers evidently wished to present Symonds with a token of their esteem and decided on a warming pan as a practical gift. The engraved inscription inside the bell matched the Bell Tavern's signpost. The additional inscription praised Symonds as a patriot, friend of George Washington, and a poet, truly a prominent citizen and worthy of appreciation. After the Revolution, the family moved west into upstate New York. His son, Green Symonds, represents the next stage of expansion into the fertile lands of central New York. By the 19th century, the family was established in New York. Albert T. Symonds, born in 1834, connects the colonial past to the modern Midwest. His descendants later moved to Chicago, drawn by industrial growth and opportunity. When Florence May Symonds married Arthur Edward Hedrich, this long New England lineage merged with the German immigrant heritage of the Hedrich family, uniting two major strands of American history. The legacy of the Symonds line. The Symonds and Symonds branch spans over 4 centuries, from Tudor England to modern America. It traces a path through colonial settlement, national expansion, and urban growth. Their story reflects continuity, adaptation, and the broader American experience, linking modern descendants to some of the earliest chapters of both English and American history. Among the many individuals in the Hedrich, Symonds, Fink, and Miller branches, no ancestor holds a greater historical legacy than Sir Thomas More. A statesman, lawyer, philosopher, and martyr, More remains one of the most influential figures in English history, with a legacy that continues nearly 5 centuries after his death. Born in London in 1478, More rose to prominence during the English Renaissance. Highly educated and widely respected for his intellect and integrity, he served King Henry VIII in several key roles, including Member of Parliament, Speaker of the House of Commons, Royal Advisor, and ultimately Lord Chancellor, the highest legal office in England. More is best known for his 1516 work Utopia, which described an ideal society based on reason and justice. The book became one of the most important works of Renaissance thought and secured his place among Europe's leading intellectuals. His lasting significance, however, comes from his moral stand against Henry VIII. When the king broke from the Catholic Church, More refused to support the decision or recognize Henry as head of the Church of England. As a result, he was imprisoned, tried for treason, and executed in 1535. His reported final words affirmed his loyalty to both king and faith. After his death, More became a symbol of conscience and principle. He was canonized in 1935 and later named patron saint of statesmen and politicians. His life continues to inspire scholars and public servants, most famously portrayed in A Man for All Seasons. Within the family tree, Sir Thomas More represents a direct link to major events of the 16th century, including the Renaissance and the English Reformation. While many ancestors contributed through everyday lives of work and migration, More stands apart as a figure whose influence reached far beyond his time and continues to resonate today. The Hedrich family's connection to the Salem witch trials comes through John B. Trask, an early colonial ancestor in the Simmons branch of the family. John Trask was born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1653 and died in Beverly in 1720. His line descends through Mary Corning, Elizabeth Simmons, Green Simmons, Francis Simmons, Albert T. Simmons, Florence May Simmons, Robert Edward Hedrich, and Robert A. Hedrich. This makes John Trask a direct ancestor of Tim, Ginger, and Susan Hedrich, Robert A. Hedrich's sixth great-grandfather and their seventh great-grandfather. John Trask lived in a tightly knit Puritan society where church, family, and reputation were deeply intertwined. Salem and nearby Beverly were small communities where neighbors closely observed one another's behavior, and tensions over faith, discipline, and morality could quickly become public concerns. The Trask family became connected to the Salem witch trials through John's wife, Christian Trask. During the 1692 crisis, she was mentioned in testimony involving Sarah Bishop, who was criticized for hosting late-night gatherings, drinking, and games considered improper by Puritan standards. Christian objected to this behavior and later believed she had been bewitched. Her suffering and death became part of the accusations surrounding the case. John Trask was not a central figure in the trials, but his family's experience reflects the everyday fears and tensions that fueled the crisis. Through him, the Hedrich family is linked not just to the famous events of Salem, but to the lived reality of a community shaped by religious pressure, suspicion, and fear. His story connects the family to a defining moment in colonial American history, showing how ordinary lives were caught up in extraordinary events. The Fink and Miller Lines, German immigrants, Midwestern settlers, and the road to Illinois. The Fink and Miller branches reflect strong German-American traditions rooted in rural Europe before crossing to America during the 19th century immigration waves. Unlike earlier colonial settlers, these families became part of the German migration that shaped the upper Midwest, especially Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. By the late 1800s, both families were established in Minnesota's farming communities, particularly in Carver County. Over time, their descendants helped build towns, churches, and local economies before later generations moved toward Chicago. Their story mirrors the broader movement of German-speaking immigrants into the American Midwest. The Fink family, from Germany and the Netherlands to Minnesota. The Fink line traces back through Paul J. Fink and Christian Frederick Fink to German-speaking regions of Europe, including connections to the Netherlands. Johann Christian Fink, born in Langen in the region of Niedersachsen, Germany in 1788, represents this German heritage. Many Fink ancestors lived agricultural village lives, including families such as the Helfmans, Trapps, Kochs, Holtmeyers, and Gerdsons. Their lives centered on farming, church, and close-knit communities that extended across generations. The Holtmeyer connection. The Holtmeyer family played a key role in the Fink ancestry. Johann Christoph Holtmeyer's descendants settled in Carver County, part of a major German immigrant region. These families brought farming skills, strong family ties, and cultural traditions that shaped local communities for generations. The German village heritage. The Fink branch highlights continuity rather than fame. Ancestors like Eva Margaretha Helfmann and Hermann Hinrich Gerdsen represent the everyday Europeans whose traditions carried into the Midwest. Their legacy lives on in the agricultural communities they helped build. The Miller family line adds a deeply German and Midwestern chapter to the Hedrich family story. In the research file, this branch centers on Carl George Miller, father of Frieda Louise Caroline Miller, who would later become part of the Fink family line. Carl George Miller was born in the mid-1800s, with the file identifying his roots as German and his life later firmly anchored in Carver County, Minnesota, especially around Watertown, Waconia, Laketown, Victoria, and Chaska. Carl's father was Gotthelf Miller, born in 1830 in Welsdorf, Hildburghausen, Thuringia, Germany. This places the Miller roots in central Germany, in a region of small towns, craftsmen, rural families, and church-centered village life. Gotthelf's parents, Johann Ludwig Müller and Henrietta Juliane Caroline Ermisch, continue the line back into the same Thuringian region, including places such as Welsdorf and Schwarze. Through Karl's mother, Margareta Lucia Puff, the line also connects to families such as Puff, Gunzel, Trier, Schaaf, Manzer, and Bessler, again rooted in Thuringia and nearby German communities. What makes this line meaningful is not just its age, but its movement. The Miller family represents the transformation from older German village life into the immigrant farming communities of the American Midwest. By the late 1800s, Carl George Miller and his wife Matilda Detborn, whose own roots reached into Pomerania, were raising their family in Minnesota. Their daughter Frieda Miller, born in Chaska, Minnesota, carried that German Midwestern heritage forward. The Miller line then merged with the Fink line when Frieda married Paul John Daniel Fink. The Finks brought their own German heritage, with roots reaching back to Langen and Hesse, and a story that moved through Illinois, Minnesota, and eventually Chicago. Together, the Miller and Fink lines combined two distinct German-American streams, one shaped by Thuringian and Pomeranian rural traditions, the other by Hessian roots and movement through Illinois and Minnesota. Their descendants carried that blended heritage into the modern Hedrich family. The Breitbarth branch reflects a classic immigrant story rooted in Northern Europe, particularly Germany, Prussia, and Sweden. Unlike lines tied to colonial America, this branch is defined by the 19th century migration that shaped the upper Midwest, especially Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. For generations, these ancestors lived in rural villages and farming communities, shaped by economic hardship, political change, and the early effects of industrialization. By the 1800s, many joined the mass migration to America, drawn by land, opportunity, and religious freedom. They settled in the Midwest, where German and Scandinavian immigrants built thriving agricultural communities. Arriving with skills rather than wealth, Breitbarth ancestors worked as farmers, laborers, and tradesmen. Over time, their descendants moved into more diverse occupations as cities grew and opportunities expanded. By the 20th century, they were fully integrated into American life while maintaining elements of their European heritage. The Breitbarth name reflects its German origins, tied to the broader wave of 19th century immigration driven by political unrest and economic pressures in Europe. These families often settled in ethnic communities before gradually blending into wider American society. A key feature of this branch is its strong Swedish connection. Swedish immigrants, especially in Minnesota, formed vibrant communities and contributed significantly to regional development. Their traditions added another layer to the family's cultural identity. Many ancestors also came from Prussia and northern Germany during times of major change, including the Napoleonic era and German unification. Limited opportunities at home pushed them toward the Midwest, where land and mobility were more accessible. The Breitbarth line stands out not for famous figures, but for the steady contributions of ordinary people. Farmers, workers, and settlers, they helped build communities and shape the Midwest. Their legacy reflects the broader immigrant experience, one of resilience, adaptation, and the creation of new lives in America. The Breitbarth family, from the villages of Thuringia to the streets of Chicago. The Breitbarth branch is one of the most clearly documented immigrant stories in the family tree. Unlike some family lines that move repeatedly across regions and countries, the Breitbarths remained rooted in a relatively small area of central Germany for generations, before eventually joining the great 19th century migration to America. The family's origins can be traced to the villages of Oberdorla, Langula, and surrounding communities in what is now the German state of Thuringia. For nearly 300 years, successive generations lived within a few miles of one another, building lives as farmers, craftsmen, and tradesmen. Their story begins during one of the most turbulent periods in European history and ultimately ends in the rapidly growing city of Chicago. The earliest documented ancestor in the line is Caspar Breitbarth, born around 1618 in Oberdorla, Thuringia. His lifetime overlapped with the devastating 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, one of the deadliest conflicts in European history. Although no record indicates his direct involvement, simply surviving and raising a family during this era would have required extraordinary resilience. Village populations throughout central Germany were devastated by warfare, famine, disease, and economic collapse. Despite those hardships, the Breitbarth family endured. Over the next 2 centuries, they remained in the same region, gradually establishing themselves as respected members of their communities. Their descendants became farmers, craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, and tradesmen whose skills supported the agricultural economy of rural Germany. By the 19th century, changing economic conditions and the opportunities available in America encouraged the family to consider emigration. The result was a journey that carried the Breitbarths from centuries-old German villages to the emerging metropolis of Chicago, where future generations would establish deep roots in Illinois. The family's story, therefore, spans more than 350 years and reflects a broader pattern repeated throughout American history: stability in Europe, migration across the Atlantic, and eventual integration into American society. The Redman and Big Olka branches are among the most historically interesting parts of Carolyn Hedrich's ancestry, because they come from a European borderland where national identity shifted repeatedly. They aren't simply German or Polish. They lived where the political map changed around them. The Redman family, Prussia's eastern frontier. Johann Wilhelm Redman was born in 1844 in Mroczyn, today Mrocze, Poland, then part of the Kingdom of Prussia, a region later governed by Poland, Prussia, Germany, and modern Poland in turn. He likely spoke German, lived among mixed German and Polish populations, and grew up amid rising German nationalism and the social upheaval that pushed many Prussian families to America. The Redmans appear to have been typical rural Prussian farmers, agricultural workers, and village tradesmen in Lutheran congregations. with daily life centered on grain farming, livestock, and church. A deeply agricultural world, unlike the industrial workers who later filled Chicago's factories. The Bigolka family, the Posen-West Prussia connection. Wilhelmina Bigolka was born in 1841 in the same broader Prussian region, in what's often called the Posen-West Prussia corridor, one of 19th century Europe's most ethnically mixed areas, home to Germans, Poles, Kashubians, and other groups. Records for such families often appear under German, Polish, or Latin church spellings, depending on date and jurisdiction. The Bigolkas exemplify a theme throughout Carolyn's ancestry. Many German ancestors actually came from places now in Poland. The family came from historical regions, not modern nation-states. The Redmond-Bigolka migration narrative. Their combined story follows a common late 19th century pattern. Generations of agricultural, Lutheran, German-speaking village life in eastern Prussia. Emigration driven by economic pressure and the pursuit of land, wages, stability, and freedom from military obligation. And eventual settlement in Midwestern immigrant communities that converged in Chicago, one of the major immigrant streams feeding the modern Chicago family. Remarkably, the family's national identity changed multiple times without anyone moving. A descendant could truthfully say, "My ancestors were German," while another could say, "Those same ancestors came from present-day Poland." Both correct. The Redmond-Bigolka lines are among the tree's clearest examples of ancestry transcending modern borders. Why this branch matters. Unlike the Tudor English world of Sir Thomas More, the colonial New England Simmons line, the long village continuity of the Breitbarths, or the Swedish migration of the Werner Anderson families, the Redmond-Bigolka branch represents the Prussian borderlands, where German, Polish, and Central European identities overlapped amid shifting political boundaries, before joining the broader Midwest immigrant wave and the 20th century Chicago family. The borderlands' ancestors, people shaped as much by Europe's shifting geography as by their migration to America. The Werner family line. The Werner line in the Hedrich Breitbarth family tree is best understood not as a German branch, but as a deeply Swedish one. Although the surname Werner may sound German, the GEDCOM evidence points to Swedish origins. In fact, the name appears to have been adopted or stabilized later, after generations of Swedish patronymic naming. Before Werner became the family name carried into Chicago, Charles Werner's ancestors used names such as Johansson, Larsson, Andersson, Olofsson, Håkansdotter, Nilsdotter, and Andreasson, classic Swedish naming patterns tied to a father's given name. At the center of this branch is Charles Ludwig Werner, born in 1880 in Göteborg's Kristina parish, in Göteborg och Bohus, Sweden. Charles represents the turning point between the old Swedish world and the modern American family story. According to the research, he arrived in America in 1903, settled in Chicago, became naturalized in 1917, and worked as a butcher and meat market man. By the 1910, 1920, and 1930 census records, he was living in Chicago and supporting his family through that trade. But Charles did not come from nowhere. Behind him is a long chain of Swedish families rooted especially in Husna, Mark, Västergötland, Älvsborg, and later Göteborg. These were rural Swedish parish communities, places of farms, church records, village clusters, household examinations, seasonal labor, and close-knit family networks. Many of his ancestors were farmers, laborers, household workers, or rural village people whose lives would have been shaped by the church calendar, agricultural seasons, and the social structure of Swedish parish life. Charles's father was Johannes Johansson, born in 1854 at Grönared Västergården in Hyssna, a place that appears again and again in this branch. Johannes connects Charles directly to the rural Västergötland line. His ancestors include names such as Johan August Larsson, born in 1827 in Hyssna, Lars Andersson, born in 1790, and families tied to places like Bua, Grönared, Melltorp, Svenshult, and Nollbacka. These repeated place names suggest not a wandering family, but one deeply anchored in a compact Swedish landscape for generations. Charles's mother, Davida Beata Andreasson Larsson Werner, was born in 1857 in Hyssna Parish, Älvsborg, and later died in Cook County, Illinois. She is especially important because she helps explain how the Werner name entered the family line. Her own name combines several naming traditions, Andreasson, Larsson, and Werner, which suggests the transition from older Swedish patronymics toward the fixed surnames used in America. In other words, Werner should not be treated as proof of German origin. In this branch, it appears more like an adopted or formalized family surname layered onto a Swedish ancestry. Several notable figures stand out among Charles Werner's ancestors. One is Olof Andersson, born around 1570 in Halland, identified in the research as a landsman or sheriff, local official. A landsman held a respected civic role, helping enforce order, collect taxes, and represent authority in the local community. His presence suggests that this branch included not only farmers and laborers, but also people of local responsibility and standing. Another notable ancestor is Lars Skitter Bengtsson, born around 1575 in Södermanland and associated with the noble name Skitter af Sätra. This is one of the more historically colorful names in the branch. Skitter lines in Swedish genealogy can indicate a family connected with higher social status, military or administrative circles, or ennobled identity. While genealogical claims that reach this far back always deserve caution, the research clearly flags him as a prominent early figure. The tree also includes early ancestors such as Niels Larsson Finner Stålhandska, born in the 1500s, and other Swedish and Nordic names that push Charles Werner's ancestry back into the 16th century. Ivar Joakimsson Fleming, till Nynäs, Köka, 1487-1490 to 1548. Finnish-Swedish nobleman, knight, royal councillor, admiral. In the latest research, Ivar appears as Ivar Joakimsson Fleming, till Nynäs, born around 1490 at Sundholm, Nykyrko, Vemo härad, Åbo, och Björneborgs län, Finland, and dying in 1548 at Nynäs, Stockholm, Södermanland, Sweden. Public sources vary slightly on the birth year, with some placing his birth shortly before 1487, likely at Sundholm in Finland, but they agree on his death in 1548 and his importance as a Swedish-Finnish nobleman. Historically, Ivar belonged to the powerful Fleming family, one of the major noble families of Swedish Finland. He is described in public sources as a Swedish knight and riksråd, or member of the royal council, and other summaries identify him as an admiral. This places him in the ruling and military administrative world of early 1500s Sweden, during the era when Sweden was breaking away from Danish control and consolidating under Gustav Vasa. A key part of his significance is his connection to both Finland and Sweden. His family's roots were in the Swedish-speaking nobility of Finland, but his later identity is tied to Nynäs in Södermanland, Sweden. Sources also identify him as the brother of Erik Joachimson Fleming, another major Finnish-Swedish statesman and admiral, showing that Ivar belonged to a wider family network of royal service, military command, and high political office. In the research, Ivar's line continues through his son Lars Ivarsson Fleming till Nynäs, then through Elin Larsdotter, Anna Andersdotter Skräddare, and eventually into the Skytte line through Lars Skytter Bengtsson, Adlad Skytte av Sätra. From there, the line flows through the Swedish Werner Breitbarth branch to Karin C. Breitbarth, Caroline Charlotte Hedrich, and the modern Hedrich generation, Ginger, Tim, and Susan Hedrich. His story helps show that the family tree's Swedish branch is not only rural or immigrant in character, it also reaches back into an older layer of Nordic nobility, royal service, military leadership, and cross-Baltic influence, connecting the later Swedish-American and Chicago family story to the political world of Finland and Sweden in the early 1500s. These older generations show that the Werner branch is not shallow. It reaches far back into early modern Scandinavia, long before the family appears in American records. Charles married Amanda Charlotta Eskilsson Werner Johnson, another Swedish-born immigrant, in Chicago in 1910. Through their daughter, Karin C. Breitbarth, the Werner line flows directly into the Breitbarth family, and then into Caroline Charlotte Hedrich. That makes this Swedish branch a major maternal influence in the broader Hedrich Breitbarth family tree. So, the Werner line is a story of transformation, from Swedish parish farms and village households to Göteborg, to immigrant Chicago, from patronymic names to a fixed American surname, from rural Swedish roots to the modern Hedrich Breitbarth family in Illinois. Its importance is not only in one famous ancestor, but in the depth, continuity, and unmistakably Swedish character of the line. The Swedish branch. The Swedish branch of Caroline Hedrich's ancestry is one of the most distinctive parts of the family tree. While other branches trace to Germany, England, or colonial America, the Swedish ancestors represent a separate migration stream that shaped the family's Midwestern heritage. A story of rural 19th century Sweden, mass emigration, and settlement in Minnesota's farming communities. These weren't aristocrats or famous figures, but farmers, laborers, and community builders who helped build some of America's most successful Scandinavian settlements. Most Swedish ancestors originated in southern and central Sweden, regions with heavy emigration during the mid to late 1800s. Sweden remained largely rural, with limited farmland, population growth, and periodic crop failures, pushing younger generations to seek opportunity elsewhere. Between the 1840s and early 1900s, over 1 million Swedes emigrated, most to the United States, drawn by cheap land, letters from earlier immigrants, and the chance to build permanent new lives. Traveling from village to Gothenburg, across the Atlantic to New York, then west into the Midwest. Minnesota was a natural destination. Its climate and landscape resembled Sweden, and established Swedish communities preserved language, churches, and customs for generations. Caroline's Swedish ancestors became part of this pattern, farming, raising families, and anchoring Swedish-American culture. The Andersson family, a patronymic name meaning son of Anders, represents the classic immigrant arc: rural Swedish origins, migration to Minnesota, agricultural settlement, and eventual intermarriage with German-American families, producing the blended Scandinavian-German heritage seen elsewhere in the tree. The Carlson and related lines, Johnson, etc., came from patronymic naming farming communities that adopted fixed surnames after emigrating. Their lives centered on farming, Lutheran church life, and tight-knit cooperation. Swedish Lutheran churches were central to community life, preserving language, holidays, and identity while easing the transition to America. The branch's significance lies not in a single famous figure, unlike the Simmons lines tied to Sir Thomas More, but in collective experience. The first immigrants who took the risk to leave, the pioneer farmers who built Minnesota's agricultural economy, and the community builders, church leaders, teachers, tradesmen, whose local impact was substantial even without national recognition. Alongside the Hedrich, German Chicago, Simmons, colonial/Tudor, Breitbarth, rural German continuity, and Fink/Miller, German Minnesota lines, the Swedish branch adds the story of Scandinavian immigration, one of America's largest, most successful immigrant movements, remembered through communities and traditions rather than famous names. The Redman and Bigolka families sit at the intersection of the tree's German and Scandinavian stories, and help explain how the Swedish and German branches merged in Minnesota. What makes these branches especially compelling is their convergence. German immigrants, Hedrich, colonial New England ancestry, Simmons, German village continuity, Breitbarth, German Minnesota settlers, Fink, Miller, Swedish immigrants, Bigolka, and German-Russian immigrants, Redman, all intersect through Minnesota, one of the era's most ethnically diverse immigrant regions, where different groups farmed adjacent land, shared churches, and intermarried. The earliest American arrival story recorded in the tree appears to be the Standish Mayflower branch on the Hedrich Simons side. The file traces a line from Miles Standish, born about 1584 in England, to Thomas Standish of Wethersfield, then through Lydia Standish, the Kellogg, Berry, Field, Simons line, and eventually to Florence May Simons, Robert Edward Hedrich, Robert A. Hedrich, Tim, Ginger, and Susan Hedrich. Miles Standish is historically important because he sailed to Plymouth on the Mayflower in 1620 and became the military leader of Plymouth Colony. Britannica identifies him as the English-born military officer who accompanied the Pilgrims and helped defend the early settlement. American Ancestors' Mayflower resource likewise lists his migration as 1620 on Mayflower, with Plymouth as his first residence. This gives the family tree a dramatic first arrival moment. Before the German Hedrichs came to Chicago, before the Breitbarths left Thuringia, and before the Swedish and Prussian branches moved into the Midwest, one recorded ancestral line was already present at the beginning of English colonial New England. This branch places the family's story in the harsh first generation of Plymouth Colony, a world of wooden palisades, food shortages, disease, tense diplomacy, and survival through cooperation and discipline. Another of the strongest early arrival stories in the family research is the line through Thomas Rogers, who appears in the tree on an early colonial branch leading down through the Rogers, Goodwin, Beardsley, Stannard, Reed line. The underlying identity is historically significant. Thomas Rogers was a Mayflower passenger in 1620, traveling with his son Joseph, and he died during the first winter at Plymouth. The General Society of Mayflower Descendants lists Thomas Rogers and his son Joseph among the Mayflower passenger families, and notes that Thomas died in Plymouth's first winter while Joseph survived and had descendants. As a family history story, this is powerful because it connects the tree to the absolute beginning of permanent English settlement in New England. Rogers represents the harshest version of the immigrant experience, leaving England, spending time among the Leiden separatist community, crossing the Atlantic on the Mayflower, and then facing disease, exposure, hunger, and loss in Plymouth's first winter. In narrative terms, he is less a founding success story than a sacrifice story, one of the settlers whose death made survival possible for the next generation. Thomas himself did not live long in America, but his family line continued through surviving Rogers' descendants. The Mayflower Society's summary specifically notes that while Thomas died in the first sickness, Joseph survived, married, and had children. It also records that Thomas's other children came later and had many descendants. It is a compelling early arrival example. The family's American story may have begun not with immediate prosperity, but with a perilous Atlantic crossing, loss in the first winter, and continuity through the next generation. A final, especially strong story is William Collier, who appears in the research as born in England and dying in Duxbury, Plymouth, Massachusetts, in the 1670 era. The line in the family tree appears to run through his son Joseph Collier, then into the Pratt Berry Field branch. Collier was not merely an early settler. He was connected to the financial and political machinery that helped Plymouth survive. Historically, Collier was one of the London-based merchant adventurers associated with the Plymouth enterprise, and he came to Plymouth Colony around 1633. He later became an important public figure, serving repeatedly as an assistant governor or magistrate in Plymouth Colony. In family story terms, he gives you a different angle from the Mayflower passengers. Not the desperate first winter survival story, but the story of the investors, merchants, administrators, and community leaders who helped turn the fragile Plymouth settlement into a functioning colony. Collier's story bridges England and America in a very concrete way. He represents the world of London commerce, transatlantic financing, landholding, and colonial governance. After arriving in New England, he became associated with Duxbury, one of the important early Plymouth communities. Some genealogical summaries describe him as one of the merchants who helped finance the Pilgrims and later came over himself with family connections, settling into a leadership role in the colony. Collier was the investor who became a colonist. While Rogers embodies the peril of the Mayflower generation, Collier embodies the second wave of colony building: money, governance, land, and civic structure. Together, the two stories show two very early ways the family tree connects to America. One through the founding trauma of Plymouth in 1620, the other through the organized expansion and stabilization of Plymouth Colony in the 1630s. Three major figures in the family tree. 1. Sir Thomas More, conscience at the center of Tudor England. Sir Thomas More is the most widely recognized figure in the family tree. Born in London in 1478, He rose from law and scholarship to become Lord Chancellor under Henry VIII, placing this branch of the family within the heart of Tudor politics and the Renaissance. More is remembered both for his writings, especially Utopia 1516, which explored ideas of justice and society, and for his moral stand. When Henry VIII broke with Rome, More refused to support the king's authority over the church. He was imprisoned and executed in 1535. His story represents a powerful moment where personal conscience clashed with political power. In the family narrative, More connects through older English and colonial lines rather than the direct Hedrich surname. He represents the deep past of the tree, before America, reminding us that ancestry includes not just movement, but beliefs, risks, and consequences. 2. Miles Standish. Miles Standish stands out in the Hedrich Breitbarth family tree because he connects the family story to one of the earliest and most dramatic chapters of English settlement in America. Born around 1584 in England, Standish crossed the Atlantic with the Mayflower Company in 1620 and became the military captain of Plymouth Colony. At a time when the colony was fragile, isolated, and struggling to survive, Standish provided leadership, defense, and order. He was not simply an early immigrant. He was one of the figures responsible for helping Plymouth endure through its first uncertain years. In the family line, Standish connects forward through Thomas Standish, Lydia Standish, and then through the Kellogg, Berry, Field, and Simmons branches, eventually reaching Robert Edward Hedrich and the modern Hedrich family. That makes him notable not only as a Mayflower-era figure, but as a symbolic ancestor, someone whose life represents courage, survival, colonial beginnings, and the deep English roots that became part of the family's American story. 3. Johann George Breitbarth, the immigrant turning point. Johann George Breitbarth represents a major shift in the family's history. Born in Germany in 1824, he broke from generations of village life in Thuringia by emigrating to the United States. His decision reflected broader changes in 19th-century Europe, including economic pressure and political unrest. Immigration offered opportunity, but required leaving behind home, language, and tradition. By settling in Illinois, Johann George became part of the German migration that shaped the Midwest. His move transformed the Breitbarth line from a local German story into an American one centered in Illinois and Chicago. Unlike More or Perkins, Johann George was not famous, but his impact was deeply personal. He represents the turning point that brought a long-standing European lineage into the modern American family story. The Hedrich Breitbarth family tree is not only a story of migration, work, and settlement, it also reaches back into some remarkably old English and European lines, where traces of nobility, office, landholding, and public influence appear in the research. On the English side, one of the most striking threads is the More family line, beginning in the tree with John More, born about 1451, and leading to Sir Thomas More, one of the most historically recognizable figures connected to the ancestry. More was a statesman, scholar, and Lord Chancellor of England, remembered for his moral convictions, his opposition to royal overreach, and his dramatic place in the Tudor world. In the family tree, this line eventually flows forward through the Simmons and Field branches, connecting the world of late medieval and Tudor England to the later New England and Midwestern family story. Other English branches in the research point toward families of local standing. Names such as Brooke, Clifford, Dethick, Yard, Croft, Porter, and Trenchard appear among the earlier generations. These were not necessarily royal lines in the direct sense, but they reflect a world of gentry, knights, manor families, and regional influence. They help show that the English portion of the ancestry reaches into the social fabric of late medieval and early modern England. Land, law, church, military service, and local authority. England's influence on the family tree is also visible in the colonial branches. Families such as Standish, Rogers, Collier, Pratt, Hull, Philbrick, Kellogg, Berry, Simmons, Stowell, and Field carried English roots into New England. Some arrived with the Mayflower generation, while others came in the Great Migration of the 1630s. Their movement from England and Leiden to Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Hampshire created the American foundation of the Hedrich line. On the Breitbarth side, the nobility and influence theme appears more through older Swedish and German lines, including names such as Fleming, Silverspar, and Skrivar Silverhelm, families associated in the historical record with old Swedish-Finnish and Småland traditions of status, service, and regional importance. Taken together, these connections do not make the family story one simple royal lineage. Instead, they reveal something more interesting. A family tree shaped by English gentry, Tudor-era influence, early colonial founders, Swedish and German regional families, and generations of migration that ultimately converged in America, and eventually in the modern Hedrich Breitbarth family. In the end, the Hedrich family tree is not the story of one place, one surname, or one simple path. It is the story of many lives moving across centuries. From Tudor England and colonial New England, from the villages of Thuringia and Saxony, from Sweden's rural parishes, from Prussian borderlands, Bohemia, Ireland, and other corners of Europe. Some ancestors stood close to great historical events: the court of Henry VIII, the Salem witch trials, the Mayflower generation, the American Civil War, and the Sultana disaster. Others lived quieter lives as farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, soldiers, machinists, immigrants, mothers, fathers, and community builders. Together, they form a family story that is both deeply personal and unmistakably connected to the larger currents of world history. Across these branches, several themes appear again and again. One is survival. Families enduring war, religious conflict, political upheaval, poverty, disease, dangerous ocean crossings, frontier hardship, and the uncertainty of beginning again in a new land. Another is movement. From England to Massachusetts, from New England to New York, from Germany and Sweden to Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Chicago. Still another is transformation. The family began in scattered villages, farms, churches, courts, workshops, and settlements across Europe and early America. But over time, these lines converged into a distinctly Midwestern story. One rooted in work, resilience, faith, family, and opportunity. Chicago becomes the great meeting place of these many journeys. The German Hedrichs arrived after the Civil War, carrying with them the experience of immigration, military service, and public duty. The Breitbarths brought a centuries-old Thuringian village legacy of craftsmen and farmers into Illinois. The Fink, Miller, Werner, Redman, Bigalka, and Swedish lines carried the story of 19th-century immigrant settlement in the upper Midwest. The Simons, Perkins, Trask, Standish, and related colonial branches connected the family to the earliest English presence in America. By the 20th century, these once distant streams had become one family rooted in the Chicago area. What this family tree ultimately reveals is that ancestry is not only a record of names and dates, it is a record of decisions. To leave, to stay, to fight, to build, to worship, to work, to endure, and to hope. Each generation inherited a world shaped by those before them, then added its own chapter to the story. From Europe to New England, from frontier farms to industrial Chicago, from royal courts to village forges, from immigrant ships to modern Illinois, the Hedrich family history reflects the broader American story itself. Many roots, many journeys, and one family carried forward through time.